Post-secondary education is kinda weird and sometimes unnecessary, especially when it comes to artistic fields. Now, I'm not suggesting that you base a significant life decision entirely on the ramblings of some random small-time artist. This is just to give you an understanding of what art school looks like from the inside in order to help you make a more informed decision. As you'll see further in, I don't have many positive things to say about art school, but that doesn't mean that there aren't upsides to it, and a lot of it is going to depend on your individual circumstances. Some may really benefit from an academic classroom environment, while others will not, which is why I'm hesitant to just say don't go to art school, because I think that would be an oversimplification of a very layered topic. Possibly the biggest upside to college and university in general is the social aspect. And if you happen to be one of those heavily introverted types who spends all their time making pretty pictures and playing video games like I was, art school may be a really good way to work on those good old social skills, as well as learning how to make connections. Although I do find it rather problematic that post-secondary schools have managed to capitalize on socialization for young people during the increasing atomization of Western society. And the real question is whether that alone is enough to justify the often hefty price tag, as well as all the structural and/or systemic problems that come with it, which I'll be getting into. I obviously won't be addressing anyone by their real names in this video, and initially I wasn't even going to give the names of the schools I attended, but I haven't been associated with either for several years now, so it really doesn't matter. As I've already mentioned in a previous video, I did attend Sheridan College for animation, but only for the first semester, and I'll get into the explanation as to why further in. About a year later, I went back to school for illustration, this time at Seneca College. I'll start off by talking briefly about Sheridan's animation program before moving on to illustration at Seneca, just because it's easier to go in chronological order. I'm sure many more people are curious about Sheridan specifically, but Seneca's ILU program will make up the largest chunk of this video because that's the only program I actually completed. Also, the drawings you'll be seeing throughout are my studies of Piccolo's drawings. Practically every online artist knows who the Teen Titans fan art guy is at this point, but in case you don't, here's his Instagram. There I was, a spry young lad of 18, fresh out of high school. I had started working in a grocery store part-time while figuring out my next steps. By this point, I had developed a love for drawing and had a couple artsy friends who were going into animation, so it felt only natural that I do the same. Not because I was actually all that interested in animation itself, but because there weren't many other post-secondary programs out there that seemed to be very drawing-heavy. And to be fair, those school websites don't exactly make it easy to do your own research. I don't think course descriptions shorter than a Tinder bio are really enough to get a good feel for what you're signing up for, considering how much money you'll be investing into your school of choice if you do decide to proceed. But I'll leave my cynicism for later. I of course immediately set my sights on Sheridan College due to its reputation. To any American viewers, Sheridan is basically the Canadian equivalent of CalArts. I knew I wouldn't be able to get into the program at the artistic level I was currently at, so I signed up for a portfolio workshop in Toronto that was specifically geared towards getting into animation school. This workshop would take place on weekends and lasted about a year. By the end of it, I submitted my application portfolio, and lo and behold, I got in. Just for the record, Sheridan has since upped the ante on their application requirements from when I first applied. They now expect you to submit a brief animation along with everything else. I guess due to the sheer number of applicants in recent years, they want students who already understand some animation principles as well. I remember feeling a bit like a celebrity during orientation week, since I would run into a lot of Art Fundy students who were still trying to get into the animation program. Pretty much every art school offers a fundamentals program, so a lot of people will start off doing that in order to eventually get into the program they actually want to do. And animation was the most popular one. I'd mentioned that I was about to start animation, and their eyes would light up like, wow, you actually got in. There was this one Art Fundy student in particular who was starting his 4th attempt to get into animation, meaning he had been doing Art Fundies for the past 3 years. And I just remember thinking, damn dude, if I hadn't gotten in on my first attempt, I would have just applied to a different animation school that wasn't as competitive. Had he done that, he probably would have already been 2 years into animation rather than still being stuck in art fundies. Like, yeah, I was excited to be going to Sheridan, but the school I went to never really mattered to me. I just wanted to get better as an artist. So why did I drop out of a renowned bachelor's degree, you ask? Well, I had a few reasons. One was that, admittedly, I had a difficult time managing the course load. If I remember correctly, I had 8 different courses that semester, and if I had advanced any farther, that would have gone up to 9 in the following semester. Putting aside the elective courses, we would learn things like composition when designing backgrounds, as well as how to do panning shots in Photoshop, the classic animation fundamentals like rubber ball, balloon bowling ball physics, C&S curve, etc. Then there was of course human anatomy during life drawing, and my personal favorite, character design, in which I learned how to do my first proper character rotation. There were also intro classes to painting and storyboarding. Now, if I had been really committed to animation, I think I could have figured out a routine for myself that would have gotten me through, but that brings me to my next point, which is that I just didn't want to be an animator as much as I thought I did. Throughout most of the hallways, they would have various grad films playing on large TV screens, and I began to notice that they were all very simplistic. Which makes sense, of course. If it's your first time putting together a fully colored and animated short film, you don't want to be too ambitious to the point that you can't complete your project within a reasonable time frame. But when I say simplistic, I also mean that these short films were clearly aimed at children. The majority of animation jobs, especially those in and around Toronto, have to do with children's media, and I wasn't super jazzed at the idea of pushing myself through another 7 semesters of school just for the prospect of getting to bounce between Scaredy Squirrel and Paw Patrol if I was lucky. I also came to the realization that what I really cared about was storytelling, and that there were less time-consuming ways to tell stories that didn't involve animation. Lastly, I also had a hard time relating to my peers. There was one guy who was a bit older, I believe he was 25, who had actually gone through architecture school before switching to animation. I thought he was pretty cool. But it seemed like everyone my age or younger was just obsessed with either Ghibli movies or Steven Universe. Like, look, I enjoy Steven Universe too, but can we talk about literally anything else? Because I wasn't as invested in animation as the people around me, I started to feel like the odd one out. That combined with the heavy course load made for a rather isolating experience. If I had the social ability I do now, I'm sure I could have navigated that aspect of it a lot better, but that was not the case back in my late teens. Due to all these compounding factors, by the halfway point of that semester, I decided that I would drop out. Though it would be more accurate to say that I flunked out. The mature thing to do would have been to fill out the required forms in order to officially drop out and still salvage my GPA, but I did not do that. I just gradually stopped showing up to my classes, went home for winter break, and never went back. So there's a pro tip for you. If you do decide to drop out of a program, I recommend doing it the right way. Don't just stop showing up without saying anything to anyone like I did. I did have some vague plans about how I would start carving my own path as an indie artist, but over the next year I eventually had to admit to myself that those plans were not working out, which brings us to Seneca College. Seeing as animation school wasn't what I was expecting and I didn't have much of a plan B, I figured illustration might be a better fit for me. Fortunately, despite me having what was probably a non-existent GPA at this point, art programs have never cared much about grades. They care a lot more about what your application portfolio looks like. Seneca's ILU program is 2 years instead of 4 like a Bachelor of Animation is, so I liked that it was less of a commitment, and it was also significantly cheaper. I believe the tuition for animation at Sheridan is about $5,000 per semester, whereas illustration at Seneca is just under $5,000 for a full year, minus the material costs. My parents did have an RESP account set up for me to help cover tuition, but it would have only covered the first 2 years of my 4-year degree had I chosen to stay at Sheridan, meaning I would have had to cover the remaining 2 years myself, which would have sucked. So there's a bright side to everything, right? I'll go through the 3 most frustrating issues I encountered while attending Seneca because I think they're the 3 that can be found across many different art programs. The first of which was a lack of specialization. In the first year, we would learn a wide variety of very loosely related topics, some of which were also present in animation, like painting and life drawing. But others included art history, children's illustration, sculpting, digital tools, aka Adobe Illustrator, and printmaking. Now, when I first applied to the program, I had assumed that by printmaking they meant learning how to set up your artwork to be printed digitally, at which point you can order prints at whatever quantity you want, but in reality it was traditional printmaking, as in manually lining up your print and then pressing the ink into it. I really hated that class. Something to be aware of if you ever see the term printmaking in a course outline. I had also assumed that the first year would be more generalized with its courses, similar to art fundies, and that by the second year you would have the chance to get more specific and cater your portfolio towards a particular kind of job. But that never happened. In our final semester, we had a class focused on putting together our grad displays, and I was very disappointed to see that we were being given a separate assignment that involved creating multiple pieces that followed a particular theme. So instead of being given class time to improve on previous assignments, we instead had to spend it putting together a bullshit assignment all for the sake of an arbitrary grade. I basically had to put together my entire grad display during my own time because the assignment we were given in class was entirely useless to me. Judging from the current itinerary, it's possible that Seneca has made improvements to its program since I was there, as they do have something called a specialization studio in the final semester, as well as web and portfolio development, which I know I would have liked to have at the end of the program. I do think Sheridan would have been better in this regard, since they do at least let you choose between 2D or 3D animation streams by your third year, but even then, I don't think there's any reason why you would need to know every part of the animation pipeline for any particular job. In my opinion, it's overkill and just encourages people to pull unnecessary all-nighters. Second pro tip, contrary to popular belief, you do not need to sacrifice your health for your art. Get some goddamn sleep, get some sunlight every once in a while, and eat something other than Subway. Even if it means getting a 0 on an assignment or two, you'll be a lot more willing to show up to class and will mentally feel much better about your situation. This is the advice I would give to my younger self. The second issue that would come up pretty frequently was that parts of my program seemed very outdated. Our business course, for instance, felt like it was straight out of the 1980s, and it wasn't until my third semester that they finally brought someone in who actually understood how the internet worked. But even then, this was a social media manager for multiple businesses who would be posting photos like every day, and you can't really do the same with artwork without burning yourself out, so most of the advice still didn't feel relevant to an artistic career. On average, my professors tended to be in their 40s, 50s, or even 60s, which isn't necessarily a problem so long as they understand how technology works. The teacher I had for printmaking and comics class would consistently have problems trying to use Windows Image Viewer. Like, how long have you had a laptop for? One of my other profs was even older than her, and yet he was active on Instagram, so what's your excuse? And in a different digital tools class, we were taught how to put together a WordPress site, which involved having to copy and paste a bunch of code along with other convoluted methods. And as someone who had just made a WordPress site for my webcomic just a year prior, I knew it was completely unnecessary. It can be a bit complicated getting the hosting in order, but WordPress was the easy part. It was just a matter of a few button clicks, then downloading any plugins as needed. I never had to touch any code. Not to mention the archaic method of separating color channels in Photoshop as part of printmaking, which is something I knew I would never have to use. The third problem was that we would always have to follow their curriculum at the expense of actually learning things properly. An example that comes to mind would be my painting class. We would spend the first couple weeks doing just black and white studies of objects before moving on to color, and I remember wanting to spend much more time focusing on just black and white studies, but I couldn't devote more time to it because everyone is expected to move at the same pace. Moving from black and white to color is a pretty big leap, and I would inevitably have to half-ass some of my paintings because my understanding of value wasn't as strong as it should have been. That's another thing. The amount of times I had to phone it in with assignments was depressing. Because there were so many of them, I inevitably would have to prioritize some over others, and the perfectionist side of me has always hated having to half-ass any kind of art piece. For example, I've always been kinda dumb when it comes to learning new software, and we were only given a week to learn Adobe Illustrator on top of our other classes. We were expected to make a rather complex scene with just vector-based shapes, and I've never been much of a graphic designer, so my end result was pretty horrendous. Then I'd have to go up to the front for a class critique and attempt to defend this piece of shit that I made with my limited understanding of Illustrator as if it had any amount of artistic merit. God, I hated the class critiques. Like, yeah, I know this looks like shit. I made it at 1 in the morning. Can I sit down now? Then there was my comics class, which I also took issue with. It was one of the few subjects I was genuinely interested in next to character design, so I had high hopes for it that were quickly dashed. We would spend most classes either watching boring documentaries or reading excerpts from Scott McCloud's book Understanding Comics, which is a book I already owned, so there was really no reason for me to be there in person. Some people swear by that book, but I personally found it rather dry, and I believe Drawing Comics the Marvel Way to be a much better and less lengthy resource. But you want to know the best method that I've found for learning how to make comics? By reading, looking at, and studying actual comics instead of going over the concept of sequential art textbook style. Once we finally got to make a few comic pages of our own, one of the requirements was that at least one of the panels needed to be symbolic rather than literal. So cool, all this work and I can't even use it as a portfolio piece unless I go back and replace that panel and then reformat the whole thing. That was one of the classes I ended up having to retake as well due to some health issues I had at the time. I didn't fully complete the final assignment, and handed it in late, thinking that I would at least get a measly 3% for it, which is all I needed to pass the class. But instead, I was given a fat 0. I also didn't learn of this until just after the semester had ended. I knew I couldn't retake that class again for a third time without clawing my eyes out, so I ended up complaining about it in an email exchange with the head of the program, who I already was not on great terms with for reasons, and the whole experience was rather embarrassing. I don't think I have enough time-lapse footage to go into more detail than that, but maybe I'll make a part 2 to this at some point. We'll see. Oh, and here's a final pro tip. Art kits are expensive as hell, so instead of buying them all at retail price, try and get used materials off of students in later years who don't need them anymore. That's something else I wish I had been smarter about. Overall, I found that my illustration program had too much of an emphasis on fine arts and not enough digital stuff, since it was run by people who, quite frankly, don't understand the modern state of the industry because they chose to remain in their academic bubble for the past 10 plus years. Also, grades are meaningless. I guarantee that no employer working in an artistic industry is going to ask you how high your grades were. As I mentioned earlier, all that matters is the quality of your portfolio and ideally making a connection or two to help you get your foot in the door. I can't say I found art school to be very enjoyable at all, but I was fortunate in that I finished my program without any student debt, and I ended up graduating in winter of 2019, and we all know what happened just a couple months later. But the question remains, what would I do differently if I were able to turn back the clock? Well, if I could go back in time, I would have just registered for online workshops and purchased a few art books at a fraction of what tuition typically costs. I, for example, did a mentorship through storyboardart.org a couple years ago and found it to be very professional. The lessons are structured in an intuitive way, you get access to multiple working story artists via Discord who are quick to respond to questions, and there's no real deadlines for assignments, meaning you're able to learn things at your own pace. This isn't a sponsor, by the way, it's just something I'd recommend to anyone wanting to learn more about storyboarding. I didn't end up finishing the whole mentorship, but I did learn a lot, and it serves as a good example of specialization. You're not required to take a bunch of unrelated courses, it's just storyboarding. This is how you build a portfolio, this is how you improve your workflow, this is how you break into the industry, etc. In addition to that, using any money left over, I could then commute into the city and start attending different art and networking events, which would satisfy the social element required in starting a career. In short, I would encourage you to go to art school if you either don't know what you want to focus on and would like a chance to try out a bunch of different mediums, or if you're looking for a way to connect with some like-minded people. but if you're going to school purely for the sake of bettering yourself as an artist, don't do it. I can tell you right now that 90 to 95% of everything I know about drawing and aesthetics was learned outside of a classroom. If you want to learn how to make professional-looking work, all you need is a computer and an internet connection. So if you're watching this video right now, then you're all set. I also shudder to think what the state of art school is like now with all the AI craze. If I were ever assigned an AI-related project, I would just refuse to do it. Go ahead, give me a 0. I don't care. This isn't what I signed up for. Also, don't bother with art school if it means going into debt. I mean, if it's just a matter of taking out a small loan, then that's not a huge deal. You could probably cover that with some grant money. But if you have your eye on one of these schools asking for like 50 grand in tuition, it's a scam. 100% a scam. I don't care what quality of art education you're getting there, I guarantee it's not worth that kind of money. During my brief stay at Sheridan, it seemed like everyone else had a particular dream job or studio that they wanted to work for. People would say, I'm gonna work for Pixar or Disney, Blizzard Studios, Riot, so on and so forth. And if you do have a specific studio in mind, it does make things easier since you can then cater your portfolio to fit their style and appeal to that one studio. But whenever I was asked that same question, I wouldn't have an answer. I just wanted to be able to support myself by creating things and telling stories, and I still do. Had I been more honest with myself from the start about my desire to go indie and my interest in teaching online, I would probably be a lot farther along than I am now. But instead, I have an expensive piece of paper that sits in my closet collecting dust. If you've already gone through an art program, let me know in the comments if you either agree or disagree with the things I've said, and I'm happy to answer any other questions from any soon-to-be students. But that's all for this video. See ya.